Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this will be our third out of 7 classes in our Astrological Magic series. So in our first class, we mainly focused on the symbolism of the hexagram. Oh, hold on, let me make sure I'm recording this the way I wanted to. No, let me switch. Okay, we should be good now. Okay, sorry about that. Right, in our first class, we talked about the hexagram, some of the symbolism of the hexagram, and then built up the components of the hexagram, the lesser ritual of the hexagram. We talked about the analysis of the keyword and some other conceptual things, and then we learned the lesser ritual of the hexagram. And so, as I said, that'll be really the foundation for the greater ritual of the hexagram. If you're familiar with the lesser and greater rituals of the pentagram, there's a similar sort of logic where you take the lesser ritual is like the blueprint, and then the greater ritual, rather than being like a specific ritual itself, is almost more like a toolkit that you can take that blueprint from the lesser ritual and change things out and rearrange the pieces to be able to invoke specific powers. And so instead of elemental powers, obviously, this time we'll be talking about planetary powers. So 2 weeks ago, in our second class, we went through the 7 planets, and I built up some basic concepts about the planets, drawing on kind of a mixture of traditional and more modern astrology. So we ran a little over time, though. So the very first 5 minutes of this class or so will really be the end of the last class that we didn't get to. So let's just do that real quick. So if you remember, at the end of the last class, we had gone through the 7 planets in order, and then finally we finished by looking at the meanings and significations of the planet Saturn. So then I just wanted to add an additional piece. This won't be a huge part of what we're doing here, but it does show up in the Golden Dawn texts, and it is part of traditional astrology and traditional astrological magic. So you should be aware of it, and that's the lunar nodes. And we'll see this actually later today, because you can use hexagrams to invoke their powers. So as we talked about a little bit 2 weeks ago, the plane of the moon's orbit, and you can see in this diagram here, that's the gray circle. That's the moon's orbit around the Earth. We're looking at this like geocentrically from the Earth's point of view. And then the yellow circle, that's the sun's apparent path around the Earth over the course of a year, not over the course of a day, right? So the sun's apparent path around the Earth, that defines what's called the ecliptic. And then the plane of the moon's orbit is inclined to the ecliptic at 5 degrees. And so you can see that there over on the left, that 5 degree angular separation there. So when there's a new moon, that's when the sun and the moon are at the same degree of like ecliptic longitude, right? So in this diagram here, you just passed the new moon. So when the sun and moon, when the sun and moon are at the same ecliptic longitude, that is a new moon. And when they're 180 degrees apart by ecliptic longitude, that is a full moon. And so, let's see, I'm trying to think of the quickest way to explain this. As the moon, moves around her orbit, she can be either up to like 5 degrees above the ecliptic, right? So like higher than the ecliptic in the sky, higher than where the sun would apparently be. And of course, as we talked about, the other planets follow roughly along the ecliptic as well. But the moon varies more than any other. So she can be up to 5 degrees above the ecliptic, like over here, or 5 degrees below the ecliptic over here. But there will be points where her path will cross the ecliptic. And so those are the nodes. And so the descending node is where she had been above the ecliptic, and then she crosses it on her way down below. So that's the descending node. And the ascending node is when she had been below the ecliptic, and then she crosses it moving upwards. So we have an ascending node and a descending node. And at those points, she'll be at the same, the same declination as the ecliptic, right? So what can happen there near the nodes is that you can get eclipses. So this is obviously not anything to scale here in this diagram, just showing you the basic idea of a solar eclipse. Solar eclipse happens with a new moon, so the sun and moon are at the same ecliptic longitude, and the moon comes between the sun and the Earth, right? And so the moon's shadow is cast on the Earth, and if you're in that small zone, it's actually much smaller than even shown in this diagram, you can get a total solar eclipse, and the sun would be momentarily like blocked out. Now, if you have at the full moon eclipse, that's a lunar eclipse where the Earth's shadow falls upon the moon. And so these eclipses can only happen when both the sun and the moon are close to the nodes, because if they're not close to the nodes, then the moon is either above or below, right? So if you get a new moon that isn't close to the nodes, the moon is like up here or down here. And then same thing with a full moon that isn't an eclipse, the moon is either like up here or down there. So it has to be close to the, so the nodes mark the points where eclipses will happen. And so these points, although of course they're just mathematical points, they're just points where the moon's orbit intersects with the ecliptic, we treat them as objects, though a slightly different type of object from the other planets. And so the ascending node, which is also called the north node, which is easy to remember, ascending is on the way up. And so the north node is when the moon is heading north of the ecliptic. And then the descending node is the south node because the moon is on her way heading south of the ecliptic. And so symbolically, comes out of like the Persian tradition. The nodes are understood as the head and tail of the dragon, right? I mean, a lot of ancient cultures have the idea of some sort of monster or other, often a dragon or a serpent that eats the moon or the sun at the time of the eclipses, right? So this is sort of drawing on that kind of mythological tradition. So the north node is the Caput Draconis, the head of the dragon, and the south node is Cauda Draconis, the tail of the dragon. So in the more like European and even the Persian and Arabic traditions, the real basic meaning of the nodes, and the one that's most relevant, I think, is that the north node symbolizes more and the south node symbolizes less. So that's like the basic principle that works for most purposes. So a planet that's like close to the north node, that planet gets amplified or increased, whatever it signifies, for good or for ill, that thing is increased. And a planet close to the south node is attenuated or decreased. Now, in the Indian astrological tradition, which is related to the traditional like Western astrological tradition, they develop the symbols of the nodes much more, and they really treat the nodes plus the 7 planets as a set of 9 and give them almost equal importance to the other planets. You can look into those traditions if you're curious, but some of that symbolism has made its way into our tradition as well, and I think especially the symbolism that sticks close to that sort of more and less is appropriate. So with the head of the dragon, you could see, in addition to just the idea of more, you could see significations like hunger or attachment, indulgence, accumulation, all these things that are along the lines of more and of increase. And then similar with the south node, along the same lines of less or decrease or attenuation, we can have things like asceticism, purgation, disembodiment, even loss in some ways. These things are all, part of the south node as well. So if you had like the north or south node at an important place in the chart, like close to one of the sect light or near the ascendant or the midheaven, you could see some of those those other significations coming into play. But in general, the north node just amplifies whatever it touches, and the south node attenuates whatever it touches. So the north and south node are always exactly 180 degrees apart. They move quote unquote retrograde around the zodiac. I mean, it kind of seems silly to call them retrograde since that's their normal motion, but they move in the opposite direction that the other planets do, at least most of the time. They occasionally like reverse a little bit, but in general, they move in that what we generally call retrograde direction. And it takes them approximately 18 years to go all the way around. So that the plane of the moon's orbit, that itself rotates relative to the Earth. In addition to the moon, making that orbit every month. So because it takes 18 years to go all the way around the zodiac, they change signs approximately every year and a half. And so lunations, the lunation is either the full moon or the new moon. Lunations that happen within 15 degrees of the nodes approximately are eclipses, right? And so if you have a new moon where both the sun and moon are conjoined and they're within 15 degrees of either the north or the south node, that will be a solar eclipse. And then if you have a full moon where, again, because a full moon, the sun and moon are 180 degrees apart, and the nodes are 180 degrees apart. If one of the sun or moon is within 15 degrees of one of the nodes, the other will be within 15 degrees of the other node, right? And so when that happens at the full moon, that's a lunar eclipse. So in like transits and things like that, the nodes are often seen to cause sort of disruptions or sometimes to produce sort of strange effects and things like that. How relevant any particular eclipses happen about every 6 months, usually like in a pair, about 2 weeks apart, one solar and one lunar. And so how, obviously these happen every 6 months, they can't be like a huge problem, of course. And so how important any given eclipse is going to be for you, has a lot to do with where it's located in your chart. And there's ways of determining whether certain people are more like attuned to the eclipses or not. We're not going to worry about that, but just something to be aware of. And also, the nodes don't form aspects with the other planets in the normal way. There's maybe one exception to this that we're not going to get into here, but in general, you're looking at conjunctions with the nodes. So when planets are very close to them, or even when planets are just sharing the same sign. So if you have, the North Node in Scorpio, any planet in Scorpio will share some of that, will be influenced by the node, but especially if they're very close by degree. All right, so that was just the end of what was supposed to be a class for 2 weeks ago. So now starting today's class for real here. All right, so we'd already talked a little bit about the magic and astrology, as Hermetic arts and coming out of the tradition of Hermeticism, and we'll be really returning that today and seeing how magic and astrology are really are intertwined. And again, drawing back to this mythological connection, to Hermes Trismegistus, the ancient sage who, in mythological symbolic terms is derived from both, the god Hermes, as well as the Egyptian god Hermes and Mercury, and then the Egyptian god Thoth. And so we'll see some more of the Hermetic symbolism as we go along today. But just, sort of recalling that this like symbolic mythological connection to Hermes and to the Hermetic tradition. And of the three Hermetic arts, magic, astrology, and alchemy, astrology in many ways is, so much of magic and traditional magic is astrological related, talismans and things like that are generally, so many of them are planetary. A lot of magic is planetary and zodiacal. And even in alchemy, astrological symbolism is really is really prevalent in the alchemical tradition as well. So astrology is really at the one of the core components of the Hermetic tradition. All right, so now some of you, I'm sure, have heard me talk about this before, about the traditional geocentric view of the world, and you've seen this diagram before. So again, this is the older geocentric cosmology, which of course we know isn't the best way to actually model the solar system. The heliocentric model works much better and is consistent with our understanding of physics and all that. But there is a certain experiential truth, right? We live on the Earth and we see the heavens in relation to us and the planets, in relation to where we are. And especially from like a Thelemic sort of point of view, we know that, any point can be the center. We live in an unbounded universe, so that any point is conceptually or could be, the center. Right, and that gets into the symbolism of Hadith and all that, right? So, there's still something to this, and it's still relevant. And, astrological terminology about things like retrogrades and things like that, that's all from a geocentric perspective. So, yeah, it's still relevant to what we're doing here. So in the center here, we have the Earth, the elemental world, and we see the Earth and the ocean, the Earth and the waters in the center, and then the area, the atmosphere around that, and then they believe that around the atmosphere was a fiery sphere. Which, although we know that there's not like a fiery sphere, we do have things like the magnetosphere and the ionosphere, which I think correspond quite well. And if you've ever seen, like the aurora, it is, it's a strange sort of fiery, but it is in many ways a fiery sort of phenomena that has to do with, charged particles, interacting with magnetic fields in the upper atmosphere and producing this brilliant light. So there is something, I think that we can still, that we can still use from that idea. And then around the elemental world, we have the 7 planetary spheres: the sphere of the moon, the sphere of Mercury, the sphere of Venus, the sphere of the sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, and then Saturn. And now exactly how many spheres are beyond that varies a little bit, but generally we have the sphere of the fixed stars and the zodiac, and then sometimes a separate. They believe that there was the fixed stars all lay on on a sphere, like a crystalline sphere that was like the edge of the cosmos. And then beyond that was the primum mobile in the Aristotelian cosmology, the prime mover, that which sort of gives motion to the cosmos. All right, and so there's a text from the Roman author Cicero, and from his The Dream of Scipio, or Somnium Scipionis. It's a short text, but it became really influential. Macrobius wrote a commentary on it, and through Macrobius's commentary, that really spread this idea of this cosmology of nested spheres. And so here's just a quote from The Dream of Scipio. See, the universe is linked together in 9 circles, or rather spheres, one of which is that of the heavens, the outermost of all, which embraces all the outer spheres, the supreme deity, which keeps in and holds together all the others. And so this is like, we're talking about the primum mobile here, right? And to this are attached those everlasting orbits of the stars, right? So now we're talking about the fixed stars. So that would be the 8th. And then beneath this, there lies 7, which turn backwards with a counter-revolution to the heavens. This idea of the counter-revolution is just that the planets move in the opposite direction to the daily motion of the planets through the sky. But just this idea of the 9 spheres that surround the Earth, the 7 of the planets, then the sphere of the stars, and then the prima mobile, or the heaven beyond that. And so there's an idea that's very common, which is that the soul comes from that higher heaven, and at birth, the soul descends through the spheres to finally inhabit the body. And so as the soul descends through the spheres, it takes on the qualities of each of the planets. So it passes through the sphere of Saturn and takes on the Saturnian qualities. Then it passes through Mars and takes on the Martial qualities. And then finally, the last sphere that it passes through is the sphere of the moon. And this is why we saw 2 weeks ago some of that symbolism of the moon being connected to birth, to embodiment, to manifestation. Is the moon, part of the powers of the moon was to literally clothe the soul in the body, right? So the moon is what gives body and gives manifestation. And you really see this like in the talismanic traditions and things like that. The moon is always used to talk about like the body and the manifestation of that, whatever power it is that you're trying to lock into the talisman. The moon has that symbolism of like embodiment and manifestation. Right, so in the process of birth, the soul descends through the spheres and clothes itself in the qualities of the planets. And then the Hermetic tradition, you also see this in the Gnostic tradition, essentially the same idea in the Gnostic tradition, but just put in very more extreme terms, where there's this idea of the ascent back up the spheres and the return to the source. And the Gnostics really see this as like escaping a prison and understand the 7 governors, the 7 planets as like sort of prison keepers locking our souls, into this world of like suffering. But the Hermetic tradition is not nearly so negative about the process of embodiment and doesn't see us as like prisoners here on Earth. And certainly the Hermetic way of looking at things is much closer to the Thelemic way of understanding these things, which sees, although this world of impermanence and which does include suffering, is only temporary. It itself is an expression, of the divine, although it's not, the divine itself. There is that which lies beyond it, but it's not to be, denigrated or simply cast aside. All right, so we have this idea of the Hermetic ascent, the ascent back up the spheres, the return to the source. So this is from the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum here, and Poimandres is he's talking to Hermes Trismegistus here. Poimandres is sometimes described as the divine mind, and also sometimes described as Hermes, the agathos daimon, the good demon, which is really pretty close to what we talk about as the holy guardian angel. So if you wanted to think of Poimandres as like Hermes Trismegistus's holy guardian angel, that would be a little bit anachronistic, but essentially along the lines of correct. So anyways, this is from a longer passage. I've just cut out a few pieces here. The whole thing is really worth reading. So Poimandres here is instructing Hermes. And so Poimandres said, "First, in releasing the material body, you give the body itself over to alteration, and the form that you used to have vanishes." So we might think that this is something like maybe something a little bit more than simple like astral projection, but something like rising the spheres, where the soul is rising out of the body, soul leaves the body and is now rising into the celestial world. The body's senses rise up and flow back to their particular sources, becoming separate parts and mingling again with the energies. Thence the human being rushes up through the cosmic framework. At the first zone, right, so this would be the sphere of the moon, at the first zone, surrendering the energy of increase and decrease, right? And then we talked about the moon as symbolizing increase and decrease, generation and corruption, all those changing things that happen in the embodied world. At the second, evil machination, right? So this is a way of talking about the sphere of Mercury. And then he goes through like all 7 spheres and really talking about the more like unhealthy or problematic aspects of each one. Even though the Hermetic tradition doesn't always see it in these terms, for the purposes here, we are talking about freeing the soul from the sort of the troubles that come from the planets. All right, so it goes through all 7 up to Saturn. And this is, right, at the 7th, this would be Saturn now. And at the 7th zone, the deceit that lies in ambush, right? So that's Saturn. And then, stripped of the effects of the cosmic framework, the human enters the region of the Ogdoad. So this is the 8th sphere associated with the fixed stars, the region of the Ogdoad. He has his own proper power, and along with the blessed, he hymns the Father. Talking about God here, right? All right, and then a little later he says, they, talking about the blessed, they rise up to the Father in order and surrender themselves to the powers. And having become powers, they enter into God. So now we're talking about entering the Ennead, the 9th sphere that lies even beyond the stars. And having become powers, they enter into God. This is the final good for those who have received knowledge, to be made God. So this ascent back to the source is also the process of divinization and of recovering and coming to consciousness and full realization of that inner divine nature that had been clothed in the powers of the planets and then finally in the material body. All right, so switching gears here a little bit, we have another cosmological image here. This is, of course, the Tree of Life in the Sephiroth. I did a 6-part class series on the Sephiroth back from late summer into early fall, and that's all up on YouTube if anybody wants to listen to me talking about the Sephiroth for a while. But just a reminder here, we have the 10 spheres of the Sephiroth, from the crown to wisdom, understanding. Now, Hesed is usually translated as mercy, but I sort of like translating it as loving kindness. I mean, it's a perfectly good translation of the Hebrew word Hesed. And I don't know, to me, I think it's more, it's a little more like evocative. Mercy has this kind of like, oh, all right, I'll let you live kind of, attitude or whatever. But whereas as the idea of like loving kindness, I think, brings the idea of something, something more directly, beneficial, right? So I like translating it that way. All right, and then Gevurah, the 5th sphere, strength, then Tefereth, beauty, then victory, then splendor, then foundation, and then finally the kingdom, Malkuth. So in Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Now the full Tree of Life diagram that we know, that wasn't really developed until the 17th century. So Agrippa's in the 3 books of occult philosophy is published in, I think, 1531 and 32. So a little bit before that, but he does, of course, have the 10 Sephiroth. And so what Agrippa does, and one of his really brilliant moves, is to take the 9 spheres, that we had talked about from like the Hermetic tradition and in the Dream of Scipio, the 9 spheres plus the Earth. It's important to remember when they talk about the 9 spheres, they're talking about 9 spheres above the Earth. So he takes the 9 spheres plus the Earth itself and attributes these just in order to the 10 Sephiroth. So Kether, the crown, the 1st sphere, that's attributed to the Prima Mobile, which is the 9th sphere, the Ennead in Hermetic terminology. Then wisdom becomes the Ogdoad, the fixed stars. And then Binah becomes Saturn. Binah, or understanding, is Saturn. And then the Sephiroth just attribute an order down the spheres. And so finally, the lowest of the Sephira, Malkuth, is attributed to the elemental world and to the Earth. So this is where we get our correspondences between the planets and the Sephiroth, is just by matching them up 1-to-1 from highest to lowest. All right, so again, just looking at this, now we're putting this on the tree of life. So again, Agrippa wouldn't have been familiar with the tree of life in this exact form, but we follow Agrippa's attributions and put them onto the form of the tree developed by Athanasius Kircher. And so you can just see exactly what we were just talking about in the last slide here, and why the planets are attributed to the spheres they are. They just go in order. Right from Malkuth, the elemental world, to the sphere of the moon, to the sphere of Mercury, to Venus, to the Sun, to Mars, to Jupiter, to Saturn, and then to this fixed stars or Ogdoad, and then to the prima mobile or the Ennead at Kether. So there's a lot, this is a great thing to sort of meditate and reflect on about how the symbolism of the planets, lines up with the meanings of the traditional meanings of the Sephiroth, right? Because of course, this is an idea that's added, like the Sephiroth, like in the Sefer Yetzirah, they're not associating the Sephiroth with the planets. This is something that's developed later. So it's interesting to think about how that symbolism comes together. And of course, in our tradition, our understanding of the Sephiroth is so much colored by the spheres of the planets. It's really like a kind of marriage of that traditional, like Hermetic cosmology with the doctrine of the Sephiroth. But yeah, so I'm not going to sort of work through the logic of each individual Sephira and how that corresponds to the planets. But I talked about that a little bit in the Sephiroth series, and it's a great thing to reflect on and to spend some time with. All right, so again, now we see that the planets are attributed to the Sephiroth they are, again, just following in order, just because of the way it's numbered, just because of the structure, right? It's not like anyone was choosing, Jupiter should go to Hesed, that makes sense, or something like that. It just follows from that one-to-one in order correspondence. But the way that the planets do fall onto the tree of life is extremely interesting and makes a lot of sense, especially when we look at the planets from a little bit more of from a traditional, like, astrological perspective. And so we see that what happens is that the luminaries, right, the sun and the moon, they both fall in the middle pillar. Then the two benefics, Venus and Jupiter, they both fall on the pillar of mercy. The two malefics, Mars and Saturn, fall on the pillar of severity. And then Mercury also falls on the pillar of severity. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, Mercury has this quality of not fitting into categories and not playing by the rules. So in some sense, Mercury doesn't, fit into those categories of luminary, benefic, and malefic, but it has to go somewhere. And again, obviously, it just falls there because of the ordering. In the mathematical, like, structure of the tree of life. In the Sephiroth series, I cited the opinion of the astrologer and scholar Benjamin Dykes, who talked about how to make sense of Mercury being on the pillar of severity, and he was suggesting that that you could think of it in terms of in traditional astrology, there's 7 what were called the Hermetic lots. They're these special mathematical points that are calculated, and each one is associated with one of the planets. And so the lots, associated with the benefics are helpful things. The lots associated with the luminaries are really sort of core things about the life and the identity. And then the malefics talk about the lots associated with malefics talk about difficult things and challenges, but the lot of Mercury, which is called the lot of necessity, that also talks about challenges and difficulties. So it sort of makes sense from that perspective to associate Mercury with the pillar of severity. But then I was also thinking that if you look at the temperament and qualities, the benefics both share the quality of being wet, right? Jupiter is warm and wet, and Venus is cool and wet. And then the malefics share the quality of being dry. Saturn is cold and dry, and Mars is hot and dry. Now, Mercury, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, is very variable, but does tend towards dry. So if we think of that dry quality of Mercury, it makes sense. The pillar of severity is being associated with dryness, and then the pillar of mercy is being associated with moisture. And then, of course, the luminaries, the moon is cool and wet, and the sun is hot and dry. So they're kind of balanced in the middle. And I also was thinking that, I think anyone who's been studying Qabalah for a while is quite used to thinking about the fact that, mercy and severity are two equal forces that both need to be balanced. It's not like mercy is good and severity is bad or something like that, right? That we need balance. And Crowley says as much, like in the Book of the Balance, what's that line? Remember that unbalanced force is evil, that unbalanced severity is but cruelty and oppression, but also that unbalanced mercy is but weakness that would allow and abet evil. I might be paraphrasing slightly, but something like that, right? That you need both, and you need both in balance. And so I think that's maybe one way that we could approach, especially if you're coming from modern astrology and this idea of like benefic and malefic are a little unfamiliar or a little off-putting. I think, approaching them from, not that they mean exactly the same thing as mercy and severity, but along the same lines, that we need a balance of both. Saturn provides, structure and discipline and really important things. And Mars provides, courage and having a spine and all that kind of stuff, right? That the malefics are important as well. Even though, if given, like, same thing with mercy and severity, if I'm ever given a choice between mercy and severity, I'm definitely choosing mercy, right? The judge says, do you want mercy or severity? I say, mercy, please, but even though, philosophically and intellectually and whatever else, I understand that mercy and severity are necessary, a polarity, that they need to be balanced. I certainly prefer mercy to severity, right? And I think we can see the same things, that I prefer, Venus and Jupiter, even though I recognize the necessity and importance of Mars and Saturn. All right, so again, there's a lot more to contemplate there. Just a few kind of preliminary things to point out. All right, and so from that idea of the Hermetic ascent that we talked about a few slides back, of ascending like back up the spheres in reverse order, we can also see how that idea leads to the grade structures in the Golden Dawn and in the AA. Now, at least as far as I know, and as far as I've seen in like traditional Kabbalah, they don't really have this idea of like ascending up the Sephira in a kind of like graded way, the same way that we do in our tradition. Again, there might be something that I'm not aware of, but as far as I'm aware of, that's an idea that's added in the Hermetic tradition. And I think it really comes from this idea of the Hermetic ascent, of ascending back up the spheres. Some of you may be familiar with, especially like in the context of AA, they talk about the ascent back up the spheres as the path of return. And we can really see that when we think of the Hermetic ascent, right? That the downward motion is the path of manifestation and birth and creation. And then the mystical path of realization is the path of return, of returning back up the way that we came to re-access that source from which, individuals descended, right? So in, like the Golden Dawn and in the AA, you start off, in the early parts of the system, you start off in Malkuth, right? Just like in the Hermetic ascent, you start from the earth, you start from where you actually are, the place that we live our day-to-day, mundane lives, where birth and suffering and birth and death and all that takes place. And then we ascend, up the spheres. So we ascend from the earth to Yesod, the sphere of the moon. And then we ascend from Yesod to Hod, the sphere of Mercury. And then from Hod to Netzach, right? And so the grade structure in that talk about ascent is, well, it's more than just homologous. I mean, it's really like based on that idea of the Hermetic ascent back up the spheres. So that's an important, I think, conceptual piece to realize about how a lot of our system is put together, and the way, again, it's really this marriage between the Kabbalistic tradition and the Hermetic tradition, which again aren't entirely separate, right? I mean, the Hermetic tradition and the Neoplatonic tradition are interrelated, and Neoplatonism was certainly, and Pythagoreanism was certainly a huge influence on the development of the Kabbalistic tradition. So they really, they join again from the same source and then flow back together again much later in the tradition in a really beautiful and I think powerful way. All right. So one thing we need to talk about is where exactly Saturn goes. So up till now, we've been talking about Saturn, as we see on the diagram on the left, in Binah here, which is understanding. However, there is, and again, I talked about this in more detail in the Sephiroth series. There's also this other sort of what's sometimes called the false Sephira, the Sephira Da'ath, right, which falls right here between the supernal triad and the 7 spheres below the supernals. And so this is Da'ath, or knowledge, which is a kind of pseudo Sephira. It can be seen in different ways. Looked at from one perspective, Da'ath is like the child of Chokmah and Bina, and in some ways can symbolically stand in for the entire supernals. especially the supernal triad, like as seen from below, the supernal triad as seen from Earth. And then, like you see in Crowley, especially when Da'ath becomes portrayed in very like negative and sort of scary ways, as the place of like falsehood and illusion and delusion that needs to be overcome. That's Crowley dealing with those things at a very specific stage in his spiritual process of overcoming that thing. Whereas it doesn't. We don't always think of Da'ath in that way. And again, Da'ath can, in some situations, actually stand for the Sephiroth as a whole. And we'll actually see why that's important later on in this series. Okay, so there's this question of is Saturn attributed to Binah or is Saturn attributed to Da'ath? And yeah, as you might expect, it's not really one or the other. If we're picturing the tree of life without Da'ath, then Saturn is in Binah, and when we're picturing the tree of life with Da'ath, then Saturn is attributed to Da'ath. And this makes a lot of sense. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, Saturn has so much of that symbolism of limits and of boundaries. We can really think of Da'ath as like the boundary, even the kind of like illusory boundary between the supernals and then the actual below. Crowley talks a lot about the idea of the Sephiroth as like beyond actuality, that in the or the supernals as beyond actuality, that in the supernals, everything is only true if it also contains its own opposite, and it's not like the world of separate individual things that lie below the supernals. And so when we're using Da'ath, we can see Saturn as that like boundary or limit between the ideal world of the Sephiroth and the actual world below the supernals. Yeah, and for certain symbolic purposes, it can be nice to have the planets below the supernal triad. Like you especially see in Agrippa's work, this idea of like you have the terrestrial world associated with the Earth, and then the celestial world associated with the planetary spheres, and then the divine world beyond that. Having Saturn and Da'ath, works really well there, where we can see the supernal triad as like the divine world beyond the celestial world. So the symbolism of both is important, and you should be familiar with both and realize that in certain circumstances, one or the other correspondence for Saturn will be the appropriate one. And as we'll see in a minute, we will need Saturn in Da'ath for understanding the symbolism of the hexagram. All right, so of course now up until this point, we had been talking about a geocentric point of view and a geocentric cosmology, but of course there's also the Hermetic or the heliocentric cosmology as well that we need to account for, where we understand the sun as the center of the solar system. And so this transition starts to happen in like the 16th century, and we see the Thomas Diggs's diagram, which if any of you have been in previous courses with me, you've seen this one before, and we'll actually talk about it later on in this series. But just the idea that, although things are still arranged in spheres, we now have the sun in the center, and that the Earth orbits around the sun and the moon orbits around the Earth. So it's this somewhat, shift in our understanding of the arrangement of these spheres. And now instead of a fixed sphere of stars, you can see this in Diggs's diagram there on the left. Instead of a fixed sphere of stars, we actually have an infinite number of stars lying at infinitely varied distances. Now, of course, we today don't tend to think the universe is actually infinite or the number of stars are actually infinite, but it's so big and there's so many of them that it essentially might as well be, right? Right. So that's enough of that, I think. But one thing I want to point out is that the tree of life, although again it was developed from this geocentric cosmology, we can really see, I think, the heliocentric in the tree of life as well. The sun is attributed to Tefereth, which is the center, of the tree of life, right? And so we literally see the sun right here in the center, and especially when we need Saturn and Da'ath, as we were just talking about, and then you just superimpose the hexagram over the tree, centered on Tefereth, and then you get the attributions of the planets to the point of the hexagram. So on the right there, you just see the hexagram just superimposed onto the tree of life with the attributions exactly as we were just talking about a couple of slides back. And then each point of the hexagram will be attributed to the planet that falls at that point. And on the left, this is an old tracing board from the Alpha et Omega. Alpha et Omega was one of the immediate successors to the Golden Dawn. It was led by MacGregor Mathers after the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn split up in 1902. And so this is one of their tracing boards. A tracing board is like an instructional diagram that would have been shown to initiates. And you can see the Sephiroth being in the planets being attributed to the points of the hexagram. And you'll see that there we have Saturn, and that says Da'ath in Hebrew. So they're specifically associating Saturn with Da'ath for the purpose of doing hexagram attributions, right? They did not write Banah there. And of course we have Hesed, Jupiter, Gevurah, Mars, Tefereth in the center for the Sun, then Netzach for Venus, Hod, Mercury, and Yesod, the Moon. All right, and then now we'll come back to this again in a couple of classes because these planetary opposites that we can derive from the hexagram, we will also see the same set of opposites derived from the geometry of the zodiac as well. So we'll come back to this again later, but just pointing out that this sense of balance with the hexagram where planets at opposite points, and we'll see this actually being employed for practical purposes as we learn to do the greater ritual of the hexagram, where the sphere where Mars is directly opposite to Venus, right? And so they are one pair of opposites. Jupiter is directly opposite to Mercury, and they're another pair of opposites. And we'll develop that sense of why they're opposite and how they're opposite when we get to the zodiac later, but just showing it to you now. And now Saturn is opposite to the Moon, but conceptually we can kind of group the Sun in with the Moon. The luminaries together are opposite to Saturn, right? The luminaries symbolize, light and brightness and centrality, whereas Saturn is darkness and limits. There's that real sense of opposites there. And again, we'll see that in the actual way that we'll draw the hexagrams, and and again we'll develop that more symbolically in a few weeks. All right, so let's see. I think we're doing pretty well on time here. Actually, yeah, I didn't mention at the beginning. So this slide deck here, part of it is just this lecture that we're going through now. But then the second half of the slide deck here, we'll go through sort of quickly, but I intend a lot of this stuff to be like reference for you in practice. So of course, I'll share the slide deck with members. I'll share the slide deck with members, and then anybody else who wants it, I'll give my contact address at the end. But I do intend some of what we're going to do here as like more of like a reference sheet than anything I expect you to get like just in the course of going through the lecture today. And I think that'll be obvious when we get there. Oh, let's see. Starlet had a question. Starlet says, would you consider Saturn to represent Earth too in that symbolism? Not in that symbolism. So Saturn, actually, and I'm glad you asked that question, because for the purposes of what we're doing, not just today, but really in this whole course, we're worried about or not worried, but we're concerning ourselves with the planets as attributed to the Sephiroth and the planets, in their cosmological functions. And we can also talk about the planets as associated with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and with the paths. So in addition to being associated with either Banah or Da'ath, Saturn is also associated with the Hebrew letter Tav and the path of Tav. And Tav links Malkuth to Yesod, and Tav is also associated with the element of Earth. Now, in astrological symbolism, Saturn also has relationships to Earth, right? Like Saturn is melancholic, Saturn is cold and dry, and the element of Earth is also cold and dry. So there's certainly a relationship between Saturn and Earth, and as we saw 2 weeks ago, some of the symbolism of Saturn is related to Earth. Saturn, governs agriculture, and it's not to govern like farming and the land. So there's symbolism of Saturn and the Earth, and then we see that also in the paths and in the letters as well. But Saturn is also the outer sphere and the limits of that outer sphere as well. So we need to understand it from those two different perspectives, both like a Sephirothic perspective versus path and letter perspective, and also like its cosmological function versus its more like symbolic significations and attributes. I hope that's clear, but Yeah, planetary versus elemental. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly part of it. And again, we can bridge between some of that planetary and elemental using that idea of temperament, where Saturn is cold and dry, and Earth is also cold and dry, and so that forms a link to them. Even though we're not saying that Saturn is like inherently of the element of Earth, there is certainly a connection. Great. And I think that stuff is all really worth like thinking about and working through and looking at the ways that the same symbols can mean different things in different contexts, and how that all works out. I mean, that's something that you really only get from years, I think, of study and reflection and meditation and practice. But those are all really good like lines of thinking. I think the thing to avoid is just to too quickly like collapse all the symbolism. One thing that I'm a little bit like opposed to is the idea of too quickly equating everything that corresponds to each other. So you'll see in some like Golden Dawn and Kabbalistic sort of material where they'll say like, the letter Aleph means the same thing as the element of air, which means the same thing as the Fool and the Tara, which means, right, like they're kind of flattening everything rather than seeing them as like chains of connection. But the tarot is a very different context in the elemental world. It's a very different context than the paths on the tree. So even though they correspond to each other, they're not like all the same. Yeah. All right. Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to do this a little bit differently than I would normally. So switching back to the hexagram rituals here, I'm going to do this a little bit differently than I would normally do it. Instead of building up all the little pieces and then putting them together, I'm going to sort of show you the overall structure, and then we'll look at the little pieces and then put them back together again. I think it's helpful to just to see where we're going here before we actually get into it. All right, so these are kind of the instructions for transforming the lesser ritual of the hexagram into the greater ritual of the hexagram. So the structure of the two rituals is basically exactly the same and is very simple. You'll start in the center facing east, and you'll perform the analysis of the keyword exactly as you would do it for the lesser ritual of the hexagram. Then you'll go to the eastern part of your temple, and you'll draw a hexagram. You'll vibrate some divine names. You'll trace the circle around to the southern part of your temple. You'll draw some hexagrams, vibrate some divine names, and you'll go around to all four quarters. And then you'll return to the center of your ritual space and repeat the analysis of the keyword. So it's really basic, yeah, so the same structure as the lesser ritual of the hexagram. The only thing that's varying is how you're drawing those hexagrams, how you're visualizing them, and then the names that you're using there. And that's all going to be customized depending on which planet you're working with. So the good news here is that unlike the lesser ritual of the hexagram, with the greater ritual of the hexagram, you're doing exactly the same thing in all four quarters. You're drawing the same hexagram, and you're intoning the same names. So in each of the quarters, you're going to imagine, we'll see in a moment that the planets are associated with specific colors. So you'll imagine a background of the planetary color. And then in the complementary color, you'll draw the specific hexagram for that planet. Then in the center of that hexagram, you'll trace the glyph of that planet, again in that same complementary color. Then you'll point your implement to the center, and you'll vibrate the divine name appropriate to the planet. Now, this is interesting. We're actually going to use several names in each quarter. So first, we'll use the divine name of the planet. Then we'll use the archangelic name associated with this planet. And then we'll vibrate Arorita. And now there's also an optional fifth hexagram. So if this is confusing or too much, you don't have to worry about it, but you can add this optional fifth hexagram. And this would happen after you've done the 4 hexagrams in the quarters and then before the analysis of the keyword. So this fifth hexagram can be drawn in one of two places. It can either be drawn like in the current direction that planet actually is in the sky. And in the coming weeks, I think we'll build up all the tools that you'll need to be able to figure out, just by looking at a chart or even just by sort of thinking about it. If you're tracking the ongoing like transits and motions of the planets, which direction that planet is relative to you right now. So you can draw the hexagram in that direction, or you can draw it in the direction of the cube of space, and we'll see that in a moment how that works. And then after you've done that, you draw you visualize and draw the hexagram exactly the same way as you did the other 4, and now you can use the full hierarchy here if you choose, not just the divine name and the archangelic name. All right, so now we'll talk about the little pieces, and then we'll come back to that. All right, so first, the hierarchies for each of the planets. Now, let's see, yeah. So the Absoluthic and Briatic hierarchies, the potency corresponding with the Absoluthic world is the divine name. And we talked in the Sephiroth series that I did. I talked about some of the logic of this, why the divine name corresponds with the world of Absoluth and what Absoluth represents, why archangels are associated with Bria and what that represents. So if you want more on that, you can check out that class series. Right, so the divine name and the archangel associated with the worlds of Absoluth and Bria. Now, there's not traditional sources for these. So what we're going to do is we're going to derive those names through the Sephirothic correspondences. And that's a little hard to explain clearly, but you'll see on the next slide, it's actually very simple. So we'll derive a divine name and an archangel for each planet through the Sephirothic correspondences. And then for the world of Yetzirah, now you'd be vibrating this or intoning the hierarchy of Yetzirah, like for that optional 5th hexagram if you wanted. Now this is a triad of powers here, and this comes from like traditional magical sources going back to the Renaissance and medieval world. So we'll have a planetary angel, which governs a planetary intelligence, which governs a planetary spirit. Now, for most purposes, you'll just stop the hierarchy with the planetary spirit. But if you're making a talisman or some sort of like Eucharistic type ritual, where you're actually trying to bring that planet's power like actually into manifestation and into the material world, you're not just going to be like meditating or scrying or doing something on the mental or astral, but you actually want to lock it into the physical world. You can vibrate the heaven of Messiah associated with that planet, and the heaven of Messiah is simply the Hebrew name of the planet. All right, so here are the planetary divine names. And so again, like I said, we're just going to use through, like for Saturn, Saturn, as we've been talking about, corresponds to the Sephirah Binah. And so we'll just use the divine name of Binah, which is Yod He Vav He Elohim. We'll just use that name as now also the divine name for Saturn. Similarly, Jupiter corresponds to Hesed. So we'll use the divine name of Hesed El as the divine name of Jupiter. We'll use the divine name of Gevurah, Elohim Gibor for Mars, the divine name of Tefereth, Yod He Vav He Eloah V'Da'ath for the Sun, the divine name of Netzach, Yod He Vav He Zavaoth for Venus, the divine name of Hod, Elohim Zavaoth for Mercury, and Shaddai Al-Chai, the divine name of Yesod, we'll use for the Moon. All right, and then exactly the same logic with the archangels. The archangel of Binah, Zafkiel, is also the archangel of Saturn. Zadkiel, the archangel of Hesed, is also the archangel of Jupiter, and so on down to Gabriel, who's the archangel of Yesod, and will also be the archangel of the Moon. Now, and one note about here, especially if you're familiar with some of these archangelic names through doing like pentagram rituals, there's different ways that people think about it, whether it's like different functions of the same archangel or angels, or just different archangels that have the same name. I don't know that there's that much of a practical consequence of how exactly you think about it, but we do want to make some sort of distinction, either whether it's a function distinction of the same archangel or actually separate archangels that just have the same name. Just be aware that Gabriel, the archangel of Yesod, and the archangel of the Moon is not the same as Gabriel, the archangel of water. So just be careful not to get mixed up about that. All right, and then we have the planetary colors. And so the colors here, what we're going to use is the king scale colors of the paths associated with that planet, right? So the Moon is attributed to the letter Gimel and the 13th path. And the king scale color, right, there's the 4 colors for each one. For our purposes, it's the king scale color that we're going to be using, and that's associated with blue. So Mercury through the letter Beth and the 12th path is associated with yellow, Venus with emerald green, Sun with orange, Mars with scarlet, Jupiter with violet, and then Saturn with indigo. And so we can see that these colors are the spectrum. Right, the white light divided up into 7 bands. We're associating the 7 planets with the 7 like divisions of white light, which is important symbolism too, right? The idea of the planets as sort of like a 7-fold like division or like expression of one singular divine power that lies behind them. That comes out really nicely in this color symbolism here. There's also like traditional color associated with the planets. Some of it overlaps with this, but some is a little bit different. And of course, one of the reasons that some of the modern colors are a little bit different than some of the traditional colors is because of the development of color theory. This idea of like the color spectrum, that's not really worked out until like the late 18th and even to early like 19th century. So this is something that is based on these later ideas about light and color and all that. So it's not necessarily that ours is right and the older traditions are wrong, just that they're working on a different sort of logic. But these will be the colors that we'll use for our purposes. So again, you'll be imagining the background color in these colors that you see here, and then you'll draw the hexagrams and the planets on top of that background in the complementary color. So if you're working with the moon, it'll be a blue background, and then we'll be drawing the hexagram and the glyph of the moon in orange, because orange is the complementary color of blue. All right, so then we need to talk about how to visualize and draw the planetary hexagrams. So we'll use the correspondences of the points of the hexagram, exactly as we saw a few slides back, derived from the cosmological and sephirothic associations. So when you're drawing these hexagrams here, now as you saw in the lesser ritual of the hexagram, we had like 4 different types of hexagrams. One, the earth form was this sort of standard, interlocking 2 triangles, and then we saw 3 other arrangements. Those other arrangements are not relevant to the greater ritual of the hexagram. We're only using the standard, interlocking triangles here that you see there. It's just which points you start from in drawing it that's going to vary from one to the next. Oh yeah, Starla's making a nice comment here about the angels and their relationships to the elements and everything. Yeah. Right. So yeah. So we're just this one form of the hexagram is the only one we're going to be using here. And so the rule for how to draw the hexagrams is that you're going to begin your hexagram, whether you're banishing or invoking, you'll begin with the point attributed to the planet that you're working with. So if you're working with Saturn, you'll begin from this point. If you're working with Jupiter, you'll begin from this point. If you're working with Venus, you'll begin from this point, right, and so on. So you begin your hexagram at the point of the target planet, and then you trace that first triangle, and then you're going to go clockwise to invoke and counterclockwise to banish. Then after you've traced your first triangle, then you're going to jump to the opposite point that you started with. So if you're working with Saturn, you would have started here and trace, if you're invoking, right, you'll trace a clockwise triangle here. And then you'll jump to the opposite point, which would be here, and then trace another clockwise triangle. If you're working with Mercury, you'd start here and trace a clockwise triangle if you're invoking. And then you'll jump to the opposite point and trace another clockwise triangle. Right, so actually really simple. Second triangle traced in the same direction as the first. Now the thing that's complicated here is that the sun in the center isn't attributed to any of the points. So with the Golden Dawn, the tradition or kind of standard form of the solar hexagram, as we'll see, there's an alternate form that's much easier to use. For the sun, you trace all 6 hexagrams on top of each other. First, you trace the form associated with the hexagram of Saturn, then the form of the hexagram associated with Jupiter, then Mars, then Venus, then Mercury, then the moon. So you'd be drawing essentially 6 overlapping hexagrams for the sun, and then you're doing that in all 4 quarters, and then potentially with an optional 5th, which is really slow, and your arm gets really tired. I've actually done this once, and it's really easy to get kind of lost and confused because you're tracing so many hexagrams on top of each other, and my arm even got tired. I had to like support my arm with my other arm because my shoulder was getting tired and everything. So not the most practical, though it's important to understand the logic behind it. Can be really energizing though. Yeah, maybe too energizing. I don't know. All right, and then after you've traced the hexagram of the planet, you'll then just draw the glyph of that planet. Right, the glyphs are the symbols that you see there on the right, and so you'll draw the glyph in the center of the hexagram. No matter which planet you're working with, you'll just draw that planet's glyph in the center of the hexagram. And again, as I said, we're visualizing, a background of the planetary color and the hexagram and the glyph traced in the complementary color. Yeah, I think doing it the hard way is worth doing at least once, and then after you've seen that, then you can then you can do it the easy way after that. But maybe you need to like earn your right to do it the easy way by trying it the hard way. All right, so this is the easier way. This is the unicursal hexagram. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the unicursal hexagram. This is actually, some people think that Crowley invented this. It actually is not. It's from the Golden Dawn had this. Of course, some people know the unicursal hexagram as like the Thelema symbol. I'm not particularly a huge fan of that. Crowley certainly liked the unicursal hexagram. I think he thought it was a cool image and he used it a few times. But there's really nothing like particularly Thelemic about it. I mean, you're welcome to your own opinion, of course. But yeah, I'm not crazy about that idea of like the unicursal hexagram as the symbol of Thelema. And really the only thing I ever use the unicursal hexagram for is an easy way of doing solar invocations. So yeah, so that its primary use, it really is an alternate way of drawing solar hexagrams. Now the points of the unicursal hexagram are attributed to the sun and moon and then the 4 elements. You notice the elements are arranged basically as they are around the pentagram, which is interesting. And then the top point is attributed to the sun and the bottom point to the moon. Occasionally you'll see the very center of the hexagram attributed to spirit, but that's not particularly relevant for what we're doing here. So I don't recommend this for elemental work. I honestly can't think of any reason why you'd ever use a hexagram. I mean, you got the lesser ritual of the hexagram. If you want to do, sort of macrocosmic forces associated with the elements. So yeah, I don't recommend this for elemental work. I can't really think of any good reason to do that. So again, mostly what this is an alternate way of drawing solar hexagrams, and you could use it for lunar hexagrams as well. I wrote a ritual one time that involved invoking both the sun and the moon. And so because I was going to use the unicursal hexagram for the sun, I used the unicursal hexagram for the moon as well, just for the nice like symmetry and not do 2 types of hexagrams. But generally you'll use the standard form of the hexagram for the moon. And so the logic is very similar. You just begin at the point attributed to the target planet, and then you just now as you go around, you'll kind of like reverse directions just because of the geometry of it. But you'll start going clockwise to invoke the sun, and then you'll just trace it all the way around. And of course, the reason it's called unicursal is because it's drawn in a single line, not in 2. And then to banish the sun, you would start here and then just trace in the opposite direction all the way around. And same thing with the moon. To invoke the moon with this, you would just start off going clockwise and go all the way around. And then to banish, you would start here and start counterclockwise and go all the way around. And then same thing, you'd invoke it in the same color scheme like we saw, and then you trace the glyph in the center. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Oh, yeah, right. So now with the cube of space here. So I talked about the cube of space in the Paz letters and correspondences series. It's a way of attributing, so spatial directions to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It's derived from the Sefer Yetzirah, and I walked through that logic in that class series. So you can check that out if you're interested in that. That was mainly in the, I think, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th classes in that series. So the axes are attributed to the 3 mother letters, and then the edges of the cube are attributed to the double letters and to the signs of the zodiac. But all we're worried about here are the 6 faces of the cube and the center of the cube, which is attributed to the 7 planets. So the bottom face of the cube is attributed to the moon. The upper, the top face of the cube is attributed to Mercury. Then the eastern face is attributed to Venus, the southern face to the sun, the northern face to Mars, and the western face to Jupiter. And then the very center of the cube is attributed to Saturn. So for that all optional 5th hexagram, if you want to use the cube of space, I recommend going into the quarter, like if you're doing an invocation of Venus, go into the eastern part of your temple and face east, and then draw that 5th hexagram there. If you're doing a solar ritual, go to the southern part of your temple and face south. If you're doing Mercury or the moon, you're going to have to aim your wand, either kind of up at the ceiling or down at the floor, which is a little unfamiliar, but it works just fine. And then if you're working with Saturn, you'll just trace the hexagram like right in the center of your ritual space. All right, so now just coming back to that slide that you just saw a few minutes ago, and just refreshing this idea that our structure is the same as the lesser ritual of the hexagram. So analysis is a keyword. Then you go into the quarter and you trace the planetary hexagram, against that background of the planetary color and the complementary color. Then the glyph of the planet in the center of the hexagram. Then you're invoking that divine name, that we saw. Then the archangelic name, and then our Arita. And then optionally, you're doing that fifth hexagram, and then you're just returning to the center and doing the analysis of the keyword again. All right, so let's see. Yeah, we're doing pretty well on time, actually, I think. All right, so I want to add one more piece here. In addition to, well, I'll just read what Agrippa says, and then I'll make some comments on it after that. All right, so this is from Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 Books of Occult Philosophy. So Agrippa says, besides the virtues of words and names, and by words and names here, he's talking about, exactly the types of hierarchies and divine names, and even, words of power and things like that, like our Arita, the exact type of stuff that we've already been talking about. So he's saying, besides the virtue of words and names, there is also a greater virtue found in sentences, from the truth contained in them, which hath a very great power of impressing, changing, binding, and establishing. Now, these are just a few excerpts of like a longer discussion. It's worth going and reading the whole thing, but this should give you the idea of what Agrippa's talking about here. So he says, therefore, in composing verses and orations for the attracting the virtues of any star, and of course by star he also includes, what we call planets, right? Or deity, you must diligently consider what virtues any star contains, as also what effects and operations, and to infer them in verses by praising, extolling, amplifying, and setting forth those things which such a kind of star is wont to cause by way of its influence. Right, so yeah, I hope that's clear that we're using verses, either, there's a lot of traditions of drawing from like sacred scripture, in the Christian tradition, you're drawing, and Jewish traditions, drawing like biblical verses that they're symbolically associating with the planets, or, in Islamic magic traditions, they draw verses from the Quran, and, many other traditions have similar sorts of ideas, right? Let's see. He says, besides, with the diverse sorts of the names of the stars, they command us, they here, he's talking about the magicians, the ancient magicians, the sages. They command us to call upon them by the names of the intelligences ruling over the stars themselves, which we shall speak more at length in their at large in their proper place. They that desire further examples of these, let them reach into the hymns of Orpheus, than which nothing is more efficacious in natural magic, if they together with their circumstances, which wise men know, be used according to a due harmony with all attention. So the hymns of Orpheus, or what we often call the Orphic hymns, the Orphic hymns is a collection of hymns, from the Greek, the Orphic tradition, and in that there are hymns. Now they're not directly hymning the planets here, but what we're going to do is we're going to draw the Orphic hymns, for example, to work with the powers of Venus, because Venus is associated with the goddess Aphrodite. We'll use the Orphic hymn to Aphrodite as a way of invoking the powers of Venus. So in addition to the more like formal and symbolic ritual of the hexagram, where it's shapes and colors and corresponding names, we'll also have this, a poetic thing, talking about the powers and the associations of Venus as a way of also invoking her powers. And the same thing with the other planets. We'll use the hymn to the associated deity with that planet, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, the associated deities, and we'll use that hymn to assist in our invocation of the powers of the planets. All right, so here's a suggested ritual outline. Of course, you're not going to use the greater ritual, the hexagram, all by itself. And so what I'm suggesting is that you use the greater ritual of the hexagram, as part of a larger working. So here's a basic outline of. I'm suggesting this is like a way of trying to investigate the planetary natures. You can invoke the planets, and then meditate on their symbolism and on their nature as a way of learning more about them, both in a general sense as well as the way that they appear, like in yourself and in your own life. So you want to start off with establishing your working space and cleansing and balancing and having that nice sort of neutral state to start off in. So you start with a lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. Then you'll do a lesser banishing ritual of the hexagram, again, just to do that on both the microcosmic and the macrocosmic levels. Then the third step here is what we call a general invocation. This is just a way of connecting yourself to a source of power. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. Any kind of like spoken invocation of like the highest or of the divinity is appropriate here. A really great, if you're familiar with the Gnostic Mass, the priest's portion of the anthem, that begins with "Thou who art I, beyond all I am, who hast no nature and no name," and then ends with, what's the last line in that? Appear most awful and most mild as it is lawful in thy child. That section is really great, and lots of Thelemites work with that. Anything of a similar intention of just invoking the Most High. If you wanted to use a more ritual form, even something like a middle pillar, or in a kind of abbreviated version of a middle pillar could work really well. Just something that helps you feel connected to the divine source or to that highest power before we then invoke the specific, like differentiated power. So after that general, other things like the first Enochian call can be used. There's lots and lots of things you can use. And you can experiment and find what helps you to get into that state. It's sort of like plugging in the batteries, putting the batteries into the machine, you could think of it as. All right, and then the fourth step, then you'll do the greater invoking ritual, the hexagram of your chosen planet, as we just learned. Then I'm suggesting that you use either the Orphicam or another invocation of the planet. I find that really adds, it's very effective. I get a lot more out of using both the ritual, the hexagram, and the Orphicam or another invocation. So I do suggest it. And I do definitely suggest doing the hexagram ritual first. I've experimented with doing the Orphicam like prior to the hexagram ritual, and I don't get as good results from that. The hexagram ritual seems to almost open the door or open like a portal or something like that, you could think of it as. And the Orphicam is that really calling in of the power. That's how I think of it anyways. All right, and then after now you've called in the power that you want to work with, and so now I'm just suggesting that you do like a meditation, on the planet's symbolism and significations. Even just 15 minutes or so is probably plenty. Of course, if you're more advanced and you know how to do like some scrying techniques and things like that, you could use those. Though just doing a simple like meditation on the planet's symbolisms and significations is great. And those that going into that state and being receptive to what the planet has to say to you, that eventually leads to kind of fuller experience of scrying and everything. So this is a great place to start. Just let although you'll be directing your mind to the planet's symbolism and significations, you're also open and receptive for things to come through and for insights and things like that. And then once you've completed your meditation, then you'll do the greater banishing ritual of the hexagram of the planet, right? So really, anytime you're working with the hexagram rituals, you'll always be doing the invoking and banishing as like bookends to each other. You'll be invoking, then you're doing the specific thing that you're there to do, and then when you're done, you're closing it down by banishing. There are two optional additions, which I find both very helpful. You can burn incense corresponding to the planet, and I also really like to put an image of the corresponding deity on my altar. I find that very helpful. I tend to, when I burn the incense, I like to think of the incense being like an offering, to that planet and to the divine powers associated with it. Though you don't necessarily have to think of it that way. That's just the way I like to do it. But I have kind of a devotional sort of bent in my my spiritual practice. And then, if possible, you can do this ritual, you can use timing that doesn't involve actually looking at astrological charts or anything like that. So it's a simple way, it's much simpler than doing like an election. And doing like full astrological elections is really not necessary for this type of work here. For things like talismans or making ritual tools, then you'd want to do an actual like election. And we'll talk about what an election is later in coming classes. But here you can just use the timing technique of planetary days and hours. So let's talk about what those are. So planetary hours, what we're going to do is we're going to divide the day and night into 12 equal sections each. So these days and hours, or the hours of the day will all be the same length, and the hours of the night will all be the same length. But the night hours and the day hours will not be of the same length to each other, right? Like all 12 night hours are of the same length to each other, and then same with the day hours. But we're dividing day and night just from sunrise and sunset. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking the time between dawn and sunset and just dividing that period by 12. So yeah, dividing the period between dawn and sunset into 12 equal sections called hours, which if you're very close to one of the equinoxes, which we actually are right now, they'll be close to an hour. But at the winter, solstice, your day hours will be about 45 minutes, and then at the summer solstice, your day hours will be about an hour and a quarter. And then that slowly changes over the course of the year, and then is close to 60 minutes, close to the equinoxes. And the night hours will be the opposite. They'll be the longest near the winter solstice, and the shortest near the summer solstice. Right. So 12 equal hours of day and then 12 equal hours of night. And now the planets rule the hours just in descending called in order. So you just have this constant 7-hour cycle of planetary rulership from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and then just starting back up again with Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, right? So you just have this constantly running 7-hour cycle that's never interrupted and never changes, even in the break from day to night, or from night to the next day. And so the idea with the hours is that planets are magically, this is how I think of it anyways. Some people talk about actually seeing like things happening in the world that correspond to the planetary hours. I don't really observe that as much. I can't remember who it is now. I heard some magician describe the planetary hours as like the planet's office hours. So the planet is like, they're not necessarily stronger in that hour. The idea is just that this is how I understand it anyways, that the planet's energies or potencies are just more available. They're more accessible during that planet's hours. You can also use it for activities. Like I've been working on a writing project. And so I've been trying to start writing for the day in the hour associated with Mercury, because Mercury is associated with writing. And I find, that I get more done, and that I'm more, that somehow my writing seems to go better when I begin it in the hour of Mercury, especially if I use like a little prayer to Mercury or something like that before I start writing. So you can use these hours for other types of activities as well, but primarily we're using it as a, for magical purposes. All right, and now from the planetary hours are conceptually first, and then from that we can also derive planetary days. And so the idea is that the first hour of the day, that's the hour that begins at dawn, that whatever planet rules that hour rules the entire day. And so the idea is that the planet will then have a similar kind of availability for the whole day in a similar sort of way that the hours also have, right? And then if you really want to get the planet at its most available, you'll do it when it's the planetary day and the planetary hour. And so the first hour after dawn, the first planetary hour, which isn't always exactly 60 minutes, that will be the hour of both the day and the planet. And then 7 hours later, in the 8th hour of the day, that'll be the same. So the first hour and the 8th hour of each day will be the hour of that planet. Now, in some traditions, this is interesting. It has to do with the way that, because the Jewish calendar is lunar. If you're doing a lunar calendar, it makes sense to think of days starting at sunset rather than starting at dawn, because that way you can know exactly when the month starts. Because you'll see when the moon, the new moon first, the crescent first becomes visible. Anyways, we won't worry about that. But there is a tradition of planetary nights as well. And so you can use that as kind of like a sub-rulership underneath the planetary days, however you want to think about that. But the idea that whichever planet has the planetary hour in the first hour of night rules that night as well. But again, that's a kind of somewhat, not entirely separate, but is a particular tradition within this. Oh, and I didn't see when your comment came in there, Starlight, but you were noticing that invoking Mercury was really helpful for memorizing Hebrew attributes. Yeah, sure. That's a great use of Mercury's powers. Yeah. All right. So here now is a table of all your planetary hours. And so the names of our days are actually derived from, actually, we'll see that a little bit better on the next slide, but the names of our days are actually derived from the planetary days. So Sunday, that's today, right? The first hour of the day today was the hour of the sun. And so today is the day of the sun, which is why we call this day Sunday. And so you can see that you're just going in order from Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, right? So that 7-hour cycle just continues unbroken. And in the last hour of tonight will be Mercury just before dawn tomorrow. And then so the hour after Mercury is the Moon. So Monday, Moon Day, we'll begin with the planetary hour of the Moon. Yeah, so again, this is something you can use for reference here. I just wanted to show you that conceptually. Hopefully that's pretty clear. All right, and then now we can see if we put the planets in Chaldean order around there's two different versions of the heptagram around this version of the heptagram, right? So we have Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, right? That's the planets in Chaldean order. But then if we trace around the heptagram, we get the order of days. So Saturn, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Now, the names of actually, and you can see this more clearly on the right. In Latin, the names of the days are literally it's just like the day of the Moon, the day of Mars, the day of Mercury, right? Now, in some like in French and something, you can really see that's still like right in the language. They call Tuesday mardi, right, from Mars day. But in English, because of the Germanic roots of our language, we use for some of the days, like the Germanic equivalents. So we have Tuesday, and I know almost nothing about Northern mythology, but the Germanic god Tu was like a war god, so he's symbolically associated with Mars. Wednesday is Woden's day, and Woden or Odin was associated with Mercury. Thursday is Thor, associated with Jupiter. For Friday, I've heard both the idea of Friday being derived from the goddess Frigg as well as Freya, but whichever goddess it was, she's associated with Venus. And then obviously we have Saturday, Saturn's day, and then Sunday. Those still have the or to us. Okay, yeah. Again, I really don't know much about the Germanic mythology, but we still, even though it's slightly concealed, we still have that logic within our 7-day week. And we'll talk more about calendars a little later in this series. Right. So again, you can just it's really easy to remember which planet. If you just learn this, it's really easy to remember which planetary day it is. And then the 1st and 8th hours of the day, those will also be the same hours. So those will be your ideal like target times for doing planetary invocations. All right, now the rest of here, I've got about 30 more slides, but the idea is this really is just for reference. So I've got like a few slides for each planet that will show you, I've got like a list of lunar incenses and incenses for each of the planets, as well as the image of their hexagram. And then there, of course, on the left is an image of Selene, who we talked about 2 weeks ago, the Titan of the Moon. So yeah, suggested incenses. We're not going to go through this all because we've only got about 10 minutes left here. But just showing you what's in the slide deck, for your reference. And then I have, how to draw the hexagrams of the Moon. And so you'll see, exactly what we talked about. Your first hexagram will start here, and then you'll trace that around clockwise. And then your second triangle will start at the opposite point from the point associated with the Moon, and then you'll trace that clockwise. And for banishing, start at the same point, but just go counterclockwise. And so I've just drawn that out there for you and shown you the colors that you'll be using, and then the glyph of the planet in the center. One thing you'll see in some of the Golden Dawn documents is the idea that you can use, you can draw the glyph of the Moon differently depending on what phase she's in. So like right now we're at just past new moon into early crescent. So you could use like the appropriate, you could draw the glyph differently depending on which phase of the moon she's currently in. Though that's optional. You could also just use, the same lunar glyph no matter what. Yeah, just an optional tradition that you can use. Now we also have the hexagrams for the lunar nodes. So everything, when you're invoking the nodes, everything is exactly the same as invoking the moon, except that you're drawing a different glyph in the center. So if you're invoking the, Caput Draconis, the north node, you'll just draw the glyph of the north node in the center, but it'll be, you'll draw it exactly the same way that you draw the pentagram or the hexagram of the moon, same colors, same hierarchies, same everything, just different glyph in the center. And then same thing for the south node, Caput Draconis. All right, and then here we've got the hierarchy of the moon, right? So the divine name that we saw, Shaddai El-Hai, then the archangel Gabriel. Now, interestingly for the moon, the planetary angel of the moon is also named Gabriel. Then we have the most complicated name that you'll see here in all of this is the planetary intelligence, Malka Betarshishim Ma'ad Beruach Sakarim, which is actually a kind of artificial name. It was probably composed. Some of these names have really important, like their gematria, the values that they add up to are symbolically tied to the planet's numbers. So this name was probably composed to add up to a specified value. And the planetary spirit Cosmodai, and the heaven of Messiah is literally just the Hebrew word for the moon, which is Levana. All right, and then the Orphic hymn to Selene. I'll read this one, and then maybe I'll read the Orphic hymn to the sun as well, and then you can check out the others in the slides. All right, so this is the Orphic hymn to Selene. Hear me, O divine queen, O light-bringing and splendid Selene, O bull-horned moon, crossing the air as you race with night, nocturnal, torch-bearing, maiden of beautiful stars, O moon, waxing and waning, feminine and masculine, luminous, lover of horses, mother of time, bearer of fruit, amber-colored, moody, shining in the night, all-seeing and vigilant, surrounded by beautiful stars. You delight in the quiet and in the richness of the night. You grant fulfillment and favor as, like a jewel, you shine in the night. Long-cloaked marshal of the stars, wise maiden whose motion is circular. Come, O blessed and gentle lady, lady of the stars, through your own light, shine and save, O maiden, your new initiates. So one thing I would suggest with these Orphic hymns is that you can modify the last couple of lines of each one. Here we're just asking the moon to shine and save her new initiates, but you can modify those last couple of lines for the particular working you're doing. So you could say, come, O blessed and gentle lady, lady of the stars, through your own light, illuminate my mind and grant me a true vision of your nature, or something like that, right? So you can modify the endings of these slightly to correspond to the purpose of your working. All right, and then just the rest of the planets here, right? So here's Mercury. There's obviously an image of the god Hermes. Listed out some mercurial incenses here. And I've added lavender here. You won't see this one in 777, but it is in some traditional sources. And I really like using lavender for Mercury, and I know a number of several other magicians who also use lavender for Mercury. So again, it's not in 777, but it is associated with Mercury, and I think it works quite well, and it can be convenient for some of the planets. Some of the incenses listed in 777 aren't very convenient or easily available. So lavender is a nice alternative for Mercury. All right, and then there's your hexagrams of Mercury for invoking and banishing. Again, you're obviously just starting at the point associated with Mercury and then going either clockwise or counterclockwise, and then drawing the glyph of Mercury in the center. Here's the hierarchy of Mercury, exactly the same sequence of descending powers. And then here we have the Orphic hymn to Hermes. All right, then for Venus and Venusian incenses there. Then the hexagrams of Venus, the hierarchy of Venus, the Orphic hymn to Venus, or Aphrodite, right? And actually, the Orphic hymn to Venus is quite long. It's really lovely. I really like this hymn, but it's quite long and goes on to 2 slides. All right, now we have the sun. So I'll spend a minute talking a little bit more about the sun. And then we see an image of Helios, the titan of the sun. So for solar incenses, we have frankincense is really like the classic and most prominent incense of the sun. Frankincense is also called a libinum. You'll see that like in 777, Crowley will make references to a libinum. It's just a different name for frankincense. It's the same thing. Cinnamon is also associated with the sun, though it can be difficult to get cinnamon in like a burnable form. If you just use powdered cinnamon or even sticks of cinnamon on a coal, it scorches and smells really bad. So if you know how to prepare incenses, you could do that. But I think frankincense is probably the best one for most purposes. All right, now, so here, this would be the standard way of drawing the hexagrams of the sun. So as we said before, it's very complicated. So you're drawing 6 hexagrams. First, you're not drawing the hexagram of Saturn. You're drawing it, in the same form as you would draw the hexagram of Saturn, right? But you're always visualizing it, against the planetary, against orange and in blue. You're not actually invoking the other planets. You're just using the combined forms of the other 6 hexagrams for the sun. So as you can see, and as you might imagine, this can get pretty confusing. So if you're going to work with this, just take your time and go slow, and be patient. And then also, you wouldn't draw the glyph of the sun until you draw all 6 hexagrams, and then just draw the glyph of the sun once. You're not drawing the glyph after every single individual hexagram. So this would be this full sequence. This for invoking, you'd be doing this full sequence in every quarter. And then for banishing, basically the same thing, starting at all the same points, just going counterclockwise. All right, and then here we have the unicursal hexagrams of the sun for invoking and banishing. And then I sort of just made a little ring of light around the glyph, so that because the glyph overlaps the lines there, just to make it a little more clear that that's the glyph of the sun right at the center of the unicursal hexagram. All right, and we have the hierarchy of the sun. Now, the divine name of the sun is Yod He Vav He Eloah V'Da'ath, but we can also use the initials of that, which would be, you can see that Yod Aleph Vav, which is sort of equivalent to IAO, which is the divine name Iao. So you can simply use the divine name Iao as an alternative name for the sun, which is really just an abbreviation of the full name, Yod He Vav He Eloah V'Da'ath. Then, Archangel Raphael, planetary angel Michael, planetary intelligence Nakiel, planetary spirit Sorath. And now there's actually 2 different Hebrew words for the sun. We have Shemesh. Shemesh is actually in the Mesopotamian tradition. Shemesh is the sun god, but it's also just the common word in a lot of the Semitic languages, or related to the common word in a lot of Semitic languages for the sun. Or Chama is another name for the sun. So you can use either one. I usually use Shemesh, because I like that idea that it's connected to the Mesopotamian sun gods. All right, and then I'll just read the Orphic Hymn to Helios. Here in Sacramento, unfortunately, we're just slightly past, today's the day of the sun, and we're just about, I think, 7 or 8 minutes past the hour of the sun, unfortunately. But here we go, the Orphic Hymn to Helios. Hear me, O Blessed One, eternal eye that sees all, Titan radiant as gold, Hyperion, celestial light, self-born, untiring, sweet sight to living creatures. On the right you beget dawn, on the left you beget night. You temper the seasons as you ride your dancing horses. You rush very swiftly, O fiery and bright-faced charioteer. You press on your course in endless whirl. Harsh to the impious, you teach good to the pious, as you hold the golden lyre, the harmony of cosmic motion, as you command noble deeds, as you nurture the seasons. Piping Lord of the world, fiery circle of motion, life-bringing, coruscating, life-giving, fruit-bearing, Payan, eternal and pure, Father of time. O immortal Zeus, you are the clear, you are the brilliant, you are the all-encompassing cosmic eye. Both when you set and when you shine, your lovely and radiant light. A paragon of justice, so water-loving Lord of the cosmos. You guard pledges, and ever the highest, you do help all. Eye of justice and light of life. O charioteer, your screaming whip drives the 4-horse chariot on. Hear my words and show life's sweetness to the initiates. And this is the translation from Apostolos Athanasicus. There's a bunch of translations of the Orphic hymns out there. This is definitely my favorite one. I really like the rhythms of it, and some of them are rhymed, and I really don't like rhymed invocations. That's just me. Of course, Crowley loves them, and a lot of other people like rhyming in their invocations, but I don't care for it. So that's one thing I like about Athanasicus's translation. I know that this translation also has really great notes. So you'll see there's some mythological references and things like that. But in the notes section at the back of the book is just called the Orphic Hymns. You can just search for his name and Orphic Hymns, and you'll find it. It has really great notes about the different mythological references and things like that you'll find in the hymns. But again, there's other translations, and you can find some online for free if you want. But this is my preferred translation. And again, in the notes are really helpful for explaining the references. All right, so we're just about an hour and a half here, so I'll just click through the last few of the slides, and then we will be done. And again, I'll make these slides available for you, as a reference for use in your work. So yeah, so here we're going through the hexagram of Mars, hierarchy of Mars, and the Orphic hymn to Aries. The Orphic hymn to Aries is interesting. You're praising him as ever bespattered with blood. You find joy in killing in the fray of the battle, O horrid one. Your desire is for the rude clash of swords and spears. So you're praising him for his warlike and violent tendencies. But then what you're actually calling on him to do is you're saying, stay the rage, stay the strife, relax pain's grip on my soul. You're sort of asking Aries to sort of, you're praising him for his powers, but then asking him to sort of go easy on you, essentially, to chill out a little bit. Just an interesting way that's approached there. All right, hexagram of Jupiter. Hexagrams of Jupiter, and that was obviously Zeus there. Interesting. You might have noticed in the Orphic hymn to Helios there that the sun was actually called immortal Zeus. You'll see an interesting flexibility and sort of fluidity in the Orphic hymns, where a whole bunch of different goddesses are all referred to as the mother of all, or giving birth to all things. It's almost as if whichever deity you're addressing at that moment, that deity is almost taken as the absolute. So there's that's just an interesting thing to pay attention to if you're looking at the hymn, the Orphic hymns, the way that you're almost reconfiguring your cosmology to be centered around whichever deity you're currently addressing. And it's interesting if you compare that to kind of Egyptian theology, they tend to do the same thing. Thoth is normally just the scribe of the gods. He doesn't have a particularly important cosmological role, but at Thoth's cult center in Hermopolis, he was worshipped there as the creator. So in that god's cult center, that god was understood as the creator. So again, this interesting kind of flexibility in the way that whichever god you're talking to is for that moment the supreme god. I don't know, I just find that logic very interesting. Anyways, there's the hierarchy of Jupiter, the Orphic hymn to Zeus. I was a little inconsistent in the way I named the Orphic hymns. Some of them I said Orphic hymn to Venus rather than Orphic hymn to Aphrodite. And here I've said Orphic hymn to Zeus rather than Orphic hymn to Jupiter. Anyways, not a big deal. I was just noticing that as I was going through here. All right, and then finally we have Saturn here. Now, I'll make another note about incenses here. The traditional incenses of Saturn, especially, so the indigo there that you see, indigo is not really an incense. It doesn't have an odor, but when you burn it, the smoke is a deep indigo color. However, it is quite toxic, so you should not use it indoors. And I've never used it at all. I don't really see any reason to. I mean, it doesn't have an odor, which is the whole purpose of incenses, but definitely don't do it indoors if you are going to you are going to use it. I've never burned scammony. I'm not sure what it's like. I have used both sulfur and asafoetida, which are both really terrible scents. I mean, they're really appropriate for Saturn, but they're really awful. If you burn asafoetida on coals, your entire house will smell like asafoetida for days. I was putting up clouds of incense for days trying to get the scent out. It's really appropriate. It's really great for Saturn, but it maybe is not something you want to burn every Saturday. And so, I am suggesting patchouli as an alternate here. You won't see it in 777. But you will see it in other traditional texts. And patchouli as just stick incense, or even as an essential oil, it may not be as obvious. But if you get a cone of the patchouli incense, the kind of dank sort of earthiness to that scent, I think actually is quite appropriate. Patchouli is horrible. I don't mind it. I have some patchouli cones that I use that I don't mind, and I think it has enough of that Saturnian quality, but it doesn't reek like sulfur or asafoetida would. So I suggest it as an alternative, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to Saturn. Kind of earthy. Exactly. All right, there's the hexagram of Saturn, hierarchy of Saturn, and then the Orphic hymn to Kronos. All right, so for the next 2 weeks, you can give it a shot, try out a couple of these. That ritual structure that I suggested is pretty involved. You're looking at sort of at least 45 minutes probably of time, if not an hour. And I find it fairly it's fairly involved and pretty energetic. So this is probably something you don't want to do like on a daily basis. And especially if you're starting off, I don't recommend doing it like every day. Doing just once or maybe twice a week for like the greater ritual of the hexagram is probably plenty if you're just starting off. So, go ahead and try a couple of planets. You might like to start with the sun or the moon, or maybe even with Venus or Jupiter. You might like when I was born at night, so Saturn tends to be the planet that I like struggle with, because it's the malefic against the sect in favor. So when I work with Saturn, my kind of scrying experiences and things like that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. I mean, they're really helpful. They help me to understand, myself and my life and my struggles and things like that. But I definitely enjoy, invoking Venus a whole lot more than I like invoking Saturn. So, maybe start with, either the luminaries or the benefics if you're new to this stuff. And I also have a link here so that you don't have to, now if you're going to calculate the planetary hours yourself, you'd need to just calculate how many minutes there are between sunrise and sunset, or between sunset and sunrise if you're working at night. Add up the total number of minutes and then divide that by 12, and then that's the length of each hour. But you can also there's a bunch of online applications and things like that. And so one of them is just planetaryhours.net. That's the one I use. Just make sure you enter your location, because this varies not just with time of the year, but also with latitude. So enter your location and the date, and it will show you exactly when the planetary hours begin and end for that day. So give that a try, and maybe try out a couple of these in the next couple weeks. For more about our work, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. If you'd like to contact me or be added to our public Google group, you can email me at provost@tots.org. And then for anyone who's not a member, of either the academic or the initiatory track, we do have a $5 suggested donation. And if you'd like to do that, you can send it via PayPal to payments@tots.org. All right, I know we're a few minutes over, but if anybody did have any questions, I'm happy to hang out for a couple minutes and answer those. Otherwise, I'll make these slides available. I'll put it up on the forum for members. Anybody who's not a member, feel free to email me, and I'll send you a link to a Google Drive link, so you can download the slides for your practice and study. Yeah, thanks everybody. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel to get updates on when new videos are available. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks everybody. 93s.